The Chinese tossed crayfish into the fields, and with their claws snapping, they turn out to be a surprisingly great way to save China's agriculture. Chinese farmer walked out to his field with a strange sack, something wriggling inside. Reaching the right spot, he cut open the edge of the sack and confidently shook out hundreds of tiny crabs.
Crawfish season looks to be off to a great start. We'll have those details after the break.
What if we told you that farmers in China suddenly found their rice fields swarming with millions of live creatures, delivered by the truckload and dumped right into the water? No warning, no explanation, just crustaceans everywhere. Confusion spread fast. Was it a scientific experiment gone wrong? A government strategy? Or something much bigger at play? Experts couldn't agree. Locals were stunned. Why would anyone flood farmlands with crayfish? What unfolded over the next few months left everyone speechless, as the twist in this story is truly mind-blowing. The quiet beginning. Crayfish in rice fields.
LSU Ag Center researchers are trying to determine the economic threshold of when it is worthwhile to harvest a second crop of rice or leave it for crawfish habitat.
It began without noise or attention. No news coverage, no public announcements. Just an unusual number of trucks moving slowly through the countryside of China, often under the cover of night. But these trucks weren't carrying food, tools, or farm equipment. Instead, they were packed with live crayfish, thousands in each load, eventually totaling in the millions. Oddly, these creatures weren't destined for dinner tables or fish markets. Their destination? Rice paddies. All across regions like Anhui and Jiangxi, farmers were told to prepare their fields. Water was added, boxes were opened, and the crayfish were let loose directly into the soaked farmland. Initial confusion and farmer skepticism. At first, people were confused. Crayfish in rice paddies? That's not how rice farming works. Most growers stick to a strict process, managing water levels, applying fertilizers carefully, and protecting their crops from pests with tried and tested methods. Suddenly, throwing in water-dwelling animals known for digging and disturbing soil didn't make sense. There were no detailed instructions, no official statements, just a clear order. To many farmers, it felt less like a farming suggestion and more like a directive from above. Put them in, watch what happens, and report back. Some refused to take part. They had worked for years to perfect their fields, and introducing an unfamiliar species that could potentially ruin young plants or disrupt the balance of the soil seemed like a risky move. Many people were just left wondering, why crayfish and why now?
Crawfish craze in Louisiana. You won't hear too many people saying otherwise. On the West Bank, Tan Trung, Fox 8 Local First.
Theories began to spread. Some guessed it might be a trial to help the environment. Others thought it was tied to increasing food trade. A few believed it had something to do with encouraging crayfish farming within the country. But none of these explanations really made sense. If the goal was just to raise more crayfish, wouldn't it have been easier to build more ponds? And why was this happening in so many different areas with different weather and landscapes? In the beginning, it was a mess. Some crayfish vanished, eaten by birds or swept away by storms. In other places, they seemed to adapt quickly, burrowing into the soil and moving through the rice fields like they belonged there. Locals began recording them, dozens of tiny red creatures crawling through the flooded rows like machines at work. These clips soon went viral on Chinese social media, mostly as comedy. But while people laughed, something more serious was taking place. A secret government experiment. Authorities didn't back off. Instead, they expanded the project. More trucks, more deliveries, and more farmers brought into the program. In some places, joining in wasn't even optional. Still, no official reason was shared. Specialists came in to examine the fields, collect soil and water samples, and study the crayfish. They measured them, marked them, and recorded what they saw. It soon became obvious that this wasn't just about food.
Crayfish.
It's crayfish.
Crawfish. We gotta find out.
We have to find out.
It was about gathering information. The entire effort was clearly organized and had been set in motion long before anyone noticed. China's modern farming revolution. What many outside China don't realize is how deeply the country has upgraded its farming systems. From high-tech water systems to drones scanning crops, China has been steadily turning traditional farming into a tech-driven operation. It's not just about producing enough food, it's about having full control over how that food is grown, from start to finish. So when millions of live animals are suddenly moved across provinces and released into essential crop fields with no explanation, it's safe to assume there's a bigger plan behind it. But for the farmers living it day to day, the real reason was still a mystery. At first glance, the whole idea seemed ridiculous. These weren't test labs or controlled trials. These were real farms, people's main source of income. What if the crayfish ruined the crops? Who would take responsibility for the damages? Would the authorities offer support? Some farmers didn't want to take any chances. They fenced off the crayfish to one area of their field to keep them from affecting the rice. Others tried treating them like farm animals, feeding them separately and not letting them interact with the crops. Crayfish rice system success. Then something surprising began to happen. After a few weeks, new reports trickled in. Some farmers noticed fewer insects. Pesticide use had gone down. The water in the fields looked cleaner. In one region, the rice even seemed to be growing faster than usual. It didn't add up. Crayfish were known to dig and disturb the soil, not benefit the plants. How could they be making things better? Officials said little but continued monitoring everything, collecting samples, recording growth, measuring progress. By the third month, things started shifting. Farmers who had followed the guidelines closely were seeing remarkable results. Their rice crops looked healthier than ever. And the crayfish? They were growing too, bigger, redder, and ready to be sold. Suddenly, a surprising pattern emerged. Both crops and crayfish were thriving together in the same field. It became clear this wasn't some random decision. It had all been carefully planned. But the questions remained. Why crayfish instead of fertilizers or sprays? Why roll this out in so many different places at the same time? And what exactly were the authorities hoping to discover? No public statement was released, but one thing was becoming clear to everyone. This was part of a much bigger test, one that was bold, different, and possibly game-changing. When China makes a major change to something as vital as food production quietly, without public discussion or explanation, it usually means they're confident in the outcome. They're not experimenting. They're executing a strategy they've already mapped out. And this time, that strategy involved millions of crayfish being released into rice paddies, not just to feed people, but maybe to change how farming works altogether. China has a long history of trying bold new ideas with its farmland.
We letting China buy up our farmland.
Over the years, the country has carried out massive projects, turning deserts green, building flood barriers, testing crops in high-altitude regions, and even growing genetically altered rice. One thing has always stood out in China's farming strategy. Take big steps quickly, and don't wait for everyone to agree first. Still, the crayfish operation was unlike anything before. This wasn't just about switching seeds or tweaking how water is used. It was a deliberate move to place a specific animal, the red swamp crayfish, into rice fields, including in areas where it had never lived before. In fact, some of those regions had worked hard to keep the species out. Environmental concerns and risks. These crayfish aren't originally from China. They come from the southern parts of the United States and likely arrived decades ago, either through fish farming or possibly via trade with Japan. Since then, they've multiplied fast, often seen as troublemakers. They dig into riverbanks, block irrigation channels, and in the wrong setting can harm local plants and wildlife. So when the authorities began placing large numbers of these crustaceans into rice fields, especially in places that had previously banned them, many people were concerned. Environmental experts were among the first to sound the alarm. The crayfish dig deep tunnels that can weaken dams and embankments, which is especially risky in regions where floods are common. Their digging can also stir up dirt and chemicals in the water, potentially upsetting the ecosystem. There was also a major concern. If the crayfish broke out of the fields and made their way into nearby rivers or lakes, it could be disastrous. China has had trouble before with species brought in from other countries, like invasive plants and foreign frogs that are now major problems in certain areas. Still, instead of halting the project, officials pushed forward. The program got bigger and moved faster. Regions that had never grown crayfish before were suddenly getting truckloads of them. Local farm offices were told to get their fields ready. In some places, farmers even received support to join the program, including financial help to buy crayfish and make simple improvements to their farms. To outside observers, it was clear China wasn't backing down. At first, the plan looked risky and careless, but behind the scenes in China, everything was carefully thought out. This wasn't just about growing more crayfish, it was about testing a new farming method. Integrated aquaculture agriculture. The core idea was called integrated aquaculture agriculture, where plants and animals grow together in the same space, helping each other thrive. In theory, this approach can increase crop output, lower the need for chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers, and boost profits for farmers. China had tried similar ideas before, like raising ducks in rice paddies to eat bugs, or keeping fish in the water to control algae. But crayfish were different. Unlike ducks or fish, crayfish live underground, moving through the mud at the roots of the rice plants. They feed on insects, dead plants, and algae, so they don't just live alongside the rice, they interact closely with it. This also made the experiment riskier. If the balance wasn't right, the crayfish could harm the rice plants. That's why many farmers were skeptical. Rice farming needs careful water control, steady nutrients, and minimal disturbance. Adding millions of burrowing crayfish seemed like playing with fire near a gas leak. However, there was a strong reason for the plan. Crayfish are hugely popular in China. They're a big part of local food culture, sold by the kilo at night markets, and featured on restaurant menus all over the country. Over the last 10 years, demand has soared, making the red swamp crayfish one of China's top freshwater exports. That's where another idea comes in. Some experts think this project wasn't really about the rice at all. It was about raising more crayfish without needing to build new farms. Traditional crayfish farming requires managing water, clearing land, and strict rules, but growing them alongside rice could be a clever shortcut, saving space and resources while meeting growing demand. By growing two valuable crops on the same land, the government could potentially double how much food comes from each field. From a logistics point of view, this was smart. China has very little farmable land per person, but needs to feed nearly a fifth of the world's population. Being efficient isn't a choice, it's a necessity. But this raised a tricky question. If the goal was to increase profits, why keep it secret? Why not explain the plan openly and teach farmers what to do? The answer might be about control. China's farming industry is tightly supervised. Many new ideas and projects start quietly to avoid public pushback or rumors. If something doesn't work, it fades away without fuss. But if it succeeds, it spreads quickly. This has been the usual approach for years. So, the quietness around the crayfish program didn't mean things were chaotic. It could have been intentional. Still, the risks were real. Millions of dollars worth of crayfish sat on fishing boats after China stopped importing Australian lobsters. Environmental groups worried about what might happen if crayfish multiplied too much. What about natural predators like birds and snakes? How could the crayfish be kept from moving into nearby delicate ecosystems? Farmers were divided too. Some saw great results, while others noticed no difference or even damage to their crops. Success seemed to depend a lot on local factors like soil, water temperature, how many crayfish were introduced, and the type of rice grown. Despite this, the government pushed forward. More training was offered, experts were sent to villages, and special crayfish food was given in some areas. It became clear this wasn't just a random trial. It was a carefully planned project led from the top, with effects that could impact the whole nation. If this plan succeeded, it could tackle several big challenges all at once. It could boost food production, raise farmers' incomes, cut down on the use of harmful chemicals, and even create more jobs in rural areas. This wouldn't just make China a top rice producer. It could turn the country into a global leader in sustainable, high-yield aquaculture farming. At this stage, no one was certain what the final result would be. But one thing was obvious. Something major was happening. A bold ecological and economic gamble was underway, involving a creature once seen as a pest. It was a risky, unusual move, and few outside the inner circle knew what to expect. But in those flooded fields, the first signs were quietly appearing. At first, the changes were subtle, just a bit more green here, fewer dying leaves there. Small shifts that hardly anyone could confidently link to the crayfish. Then, patterns started to show across different provinces. Rice plants began growing faster, not by huge leaps, but enough to catch attention. Farmers who had doubted the idea were now seeing healthier paddies with taller, more even crops. And it wasn't just the rice that was thriving. The crayfish themselves were growing quickly, getting bigger and multiplying rapidly. In some areas, their numbers doubled within a few months. What surprised many was how the crayfish behaved. Instead of harming the rice roots, they moved carefully between the rows, gently stirring the soil, almost like tiny natural tillers. Scientists started to piece things together. This was a system where farming was happening on two levels, working perfectly together. While the government kept quiet, researchers began sharing early reports. In some test areas, rice yields went up by 10 to 15%, even without using chemical fertilizers, a model for sustainable farming. What started as confusion quickly turned into cautious excitement. Farmers who were once doubtful began asking how they could better manage their fields to support crayfish farming. Agricultural officials organized workshops to teach how to control water levels.
Rice farmers like Mike Verger stumbled onto the fact that the 2-year growing cycle of crawfish synced up perfectly with the 2-year growing cycle of their rice crop.
And how to time the release of crayfish with planting and harvesting to benefit both rice and crayfish. There were still problems. In some places, too many crayfish led to overcrowding, which meant smaller crayfish. In others, poor water management caused some crayfish to die off temporarily. But overall, the results were clear. This method was working. And not just in one area or with a single type of rice. Across many regions, with different soils and climates, the system held strong. The outcomes weren't just good, they were game-changing. This quiet experiment in rural China was growing, even though most of the world hadn't noticed yet. In fact, China just went ahead and did it. Even the country's president reportedly said it would take time to see real results, but China took the leap anyway. They moved millions of crayfish into rice fields, and 6 months later, the results blew everyone away. Now we understand the plan. China wasn't just dumping crayfish randomly, they were starting one of the boldest changes in farming in recent memory. The goal? To grow 2 valuable foods on the same land at the same time, using almost no chemicals. This method, called the Crayfish Rice Integrated Production System, or CRISP, worked even better than expected. Here's how it plays out.
I'd like to mention a little bit about planting rice for crawfish. We always talk about having a good supply of crawfish.
When crayfish are placed into flooded rice paddies, they do what comes naturally. They dig, scavenge, and search for food. But instead of damaging the rice, they actually help by loosening the soil, breaking up hard mud, and letting air reach the rice roots. This helps the rice grow better without needing to plow the soil or add special treatments. The crayfish also clean the fields by eating algae, decaying plants, and insect larvae that usually harm the rice. This means fewer pests, less fungus, and a big drop in the use of pesticides. At the same time, crayfish waste works like a natural fertilizer full of nutrients and nitrogen, replacing man-made chemicals that often pollute rivers and lakes. The outcome? Healthier rice plants, bigger crayfish, and fields that almost take care of themselves. But the benefits don't end there. The rice plants also support the crayfish. Their leaves provide shade from the sun and protection from predators, while the roots keep the water clean by absorbing waste. The temperature in the shallow, flooded paddies stays just right for crayfish growth. In simple terms, the rice and crayfish help each other grow well, creating a sustainable farming system that produces 2 harvests in one cycle without needing more land, extra chemicals, or more work. This method is efficient and brings good profits. In some places, farmers now make more money from selling crayfish than rice in a single season. They sell rice to grain markets and crayfish to seafood buyers, all without spending much extra. The results are clear: higher rice harvests, less chemical use, fewer pests, and a big increase in crayfish catch. Some farms have even doubled or tripled their income compared to growing only rice. And the best part? This system can be used on a large scale. Unlike small organic farms that need lots of manual work and special supplies, this method uses what China already has: flooded fields, affordable labor, and strong knowledge of aquaculture. With the right planning and timing, this approach can work in almost any rice-growing area. It's a smart way to get more food from the same land, reduce harm to the environment, raise farmers' earnings, cut down on chemicals, and produce a popular export product all at once. That's why it seemed so unusual at first, but now it makes perfect sense. At first, this approach looked very different from Western industrial farming. There were no tractors digging up the soil, no heavy use of chemicals sprayed on the fields, just nature being used cleverly, precisely, and on a large scale. Now the world is starting to notice. Experts in agriculture say this could be one of the best ways to grow food in the 21st century. It produces less pollution, costs less, works efficiently, and is better for the climate. Environmental groups are excited about how it can reduce fertilizer use and improve soil health. What's really surprising is that this system was tested quietly, right out in the open, but without any big announcements or media hype, just results. That's the way China works. Start small, grow fast, and let the success speak for itself. And this time, the results are impossible to ignore. China has changed the minds of millions of doubtful farmers. They turned what was once seen as a pest into a helpful partner. They transformed rice fields into a dual production system. They did this by trusting nature, not chemicals, by working with the soil instead of against it. The crayfish aren't just a gimmick. They're a crucial part of the process. Now, China's rice and crayfish farming method is spreading quickly. Even provinces that didn't want to try it at first are now joining in. Training programs are growing, investments are increasing, and there's even more to come. What started with rice and crayfish is now a model being adapted and expanded all across the country. New combinations and systems are being tested, all with the goal of reshaping farming for the future. Expanding to other systems. In areas with rich wetlands, farmers are trying another method called the duck rice model. It's simple but effective. Ducks are released into rice fields where they eat pests and weeds, helping the rice grow better naturally. Their movement helps aerate the soil, and their droppings act as natural fertilizer for the water. No chemicals, no heavy machinery, just nature doing its job. In warmer regions, another method is becoming popular: fish and lotus farming. Lotus plants grow above the water, while fish like carp or tilapia swim below, feeding on algae and organic debris. The lotus cleans the water, and the fish control pests. Similar to the crayfish system, this approach turns one water area into 2 productive layers, doubling income and reducing environmental damage. These are not random trials, but part of a well-planned change. China's farming policies are now focusing on systems where plants and animals support each other, mimicking nature's balance. These methods use fewer inputs, deliver more output, and are stronger against unexpected challenges. That's crucial because this effort isn't just about growing enough food, it's about preparing China's food supply for future problems, like climate change, soil loss, water shortages, and global market ups and downs. By creating these closed-loop systems, China lowers its need for artificial fertilizers and imports. It also cuts down chemical pollution, protects wildlife, and most importantly, helps farmers earn more from the same land, making rural communities more stable and prosperous. Global impact and future vision. But there's a bigger plan behind this shift. In a world where food security is linked to national strength, China aims to lead not just in how much it produces, but in innovation. By developing efficient and sustainable farming methods, it's building systems that can be shared worldwide, along with the training, technology, and tools needed to make them work. Already, Chinese-supported farms in Southeast Asia and Africa are testing these integrated rice and aquaculture techniques. If scaled across the globe, these ideas could help countries facing environmental breakdown or economic struggles secure their food supplies. And it all started with one bold move, releasing millions of crayfish into muddy rice fields. At the time, it seemed odd and even risky, but looking back, it was just the first step in a fresh farming approach. This new way mixes old traditions with modern science. Instead of fighting nature, it works with it. While many countries see certain animals as pests, China sees opportunity. Where usual farming treats animals and crops separately, China looks for ways to make them work together. The future China is aiming for is based on this idea. Farms won't just be places for growing food, they'll be living ecosystems. Waste won't be thrown away, it will be reused. Every creature, whether crayfish, ducks, fish, or snails, will play a useful part in the bigger system. This system is designed to be strong, profitable, and self-reliant. It can handle changes in climate, reduce expenses, and boost production. More than that, it gives China an important advantage in a world where food security is closely tied to national strength. This isn't just about farming, it's about how a nation combined science planning and smart decisions to transform agriculture in a way the world hasn't seen before. What looked like chaos from afar was actually a carefully planned revolution happening quietly and on a massive scale. Step by step, pond by pond and claw by claw, China is shaping the future of food production. Now we want to hear from you. What's your take on this bold new approach? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.